I call the Honourable Member Andrew Williams.
Mr Speaker, I rise on behalf of New Zealand First to speak to the Building Amendment Bill number 3 for the third time, and we've already covered a lot of material on this, and New Zealand First opposes this bill. We've already heard all the comments in relation to how the Leaky Homes national disaster came about because of inadequate building codes, because of inadequate building practices, and that has ended up with this country and our nation carrying the bill for something like $20 billion in remedial works to sort that building disaster out. We've heard from the Minister today as to why this is necessary, this Building Amendment Bill, to reduce the red tape and reduce the costs of building and to reduce the compliance costs around building and to put more responsibility onto the building industry, the builders themselves, and indeed the end consumer, so that there's less buyer beware, there is more buyer aware. However, Mr Speaker, I would like to draw the House's attention to a situation at Cave Creek in 1995 on the 28th of April, where 14 people died while standing on a viewing platform which collapsed. And the inquiry that followed from that particular very sad tragedy at Cave Creek was that it collapsed as a result of inadequate building practices. And from that it was shown that because the platform had been constructed poorly, with inadequate supports, with inadequate bracing, with inadequate substructure supports for the beams, the weight of the people was too great and it collapsed. Mr Speaker, this bill, in a sense, is going down the same path. It is taking the building industry into areas of self-regulation, in a sense, into an area where the building industry will be policing itself on the final construction of properties, homes, decks and other structures. And leading into the bill number 4, and I've just been reading the bill number 4, there are so many open-ended situations where the building practices will certainly be perhaps in a suspect situation, leaving, I believe, consumers and New Zealanders open to great risk. While we support reduction in costs, as anyone does, to try and find cost savings across the board to try and lower the cost of housing in New Zealand, at the same time we don't think that should go hand in hand with reducing what should be a very controlled regulatory environment and a controlled environment that ensures safety at all times for the property owner. We have heard that licensed building practitioners will be required as of the 1st of March this year to build all structures unless there is an exemption for a DIY person building their property. However, Mr Speaker, there's been great comment about the varying standards and levels of expertise of elements within the building workforce, because this country has not been a great one in recent years for apprenticeships. It has not been a great one for training our younger people coming through in these trades. This has been a situation where for more than 2 decades now we've had a declining number of tradespeople moving into some of these areas, and where the skill levels perhaps are not the same as the good old builders of days gone by. And days gone by, and I built my first home myself, Mr Speaker, and it's still standing and it's as dry as a bone and it will never leak. But I spent the best part of 2 or 3 years of my weekends building that home and making sure it was a good home and making sure that I absolutely went over the top in terms of the safety aspects of building that home. I look at the houses some 25 years later, 30 years later, and I look at what is now being constructed, and there still are questions about the products going into many of these properties. There's still questions about the method of construction, And there's particularly questions about the design aspects, and such as overhangs and making sure there's sufficient... Mr. Speaker? Were you speaking to me? No? Okay. And making sure that there's sufficient safeguards. Too often these days, Mr. Speaker, we're seeing things just being bogged up with varying silicants and sealants and anything that comes out of a tube, with the thought that that will be good and that'll keep the property safe and warm and dry, only to find that a number of years later it is dried, cracked, and the water is getting in. We're seeing often inadequate materials being used. We're seeing a cheapening of materials being used. We're seeing shortcuts being taken on building materials to try and get an end product as cheap as possible. Mr. Speaker, in many respects, this is a back to the future bill, because we have not learned from the past, it would seem. In the 1990s, we had the onset of the leaky home situation. We had the lowering of the building code. We had the lowering of building standards. The Standards Authority allowed new inferior materials to be used, such as monolithic cladding, directly applied to untreated air-dried timber in an unvented situation. And once the silicants and all the sealants and everything else started to crack, and much of that cladding started to crack, the leaky homes, the leaky schools, the leaky hospitals, the leaky commercial buildings problem commenced. Mr. Speaker, in a sense, we're going back to that. This country at the moment faces a $20 billion bill for that disaster from the 1990s, from previous governments who should have learnt from that. This government is now going down the track of basically giving carte blanche, open treatment to the building industry to start a whole new potential leaky building situation all over again. Mr. Speaker, New Zealand First is very worried about this bill. We're also worried about the next part of this number 4 bill as well, because when I look at that and I see how it is so open and so open to interpretation of what could be built by varying people within the building industry, with next to no compliance requirements, and so many different structures that will be permitted to be built without consents in the future, Mr. Speaker, we could see a whole new national leaky home situation all over again in the next decade or two as a result of this Bill number 3 and Bill number 4 coming before this House. New Zealand First will continue to oppose it, and we will continue to highlight many of the negative aspects of it, Mr. Speaker, that really do put us at risk, and not only at risk from a safety point of view, but also a major financial point of view. And this country, I don't think, can once again afford to be looking down the barrel of a major problem with our housing, with our schools, with our buildings. Mr. Speaker, this government talks about, for instance, putting money back into the education system and saying by selling the state assets they're going to put money into the schools. I know, for example, one school on the North Shore that is having to spend $20 to $30 million rebuilding many of its leaky buildings and many of its structures because they have failed. Mr. Speaker, through this Building Amendment Bill number 3 and Building Amendment Bill number 4, potentially, who knows, but we could have this happening all over again, and this nation could be up for a very large bill in the future.
Mr. Speaker.
I call the Honourable Member Nikki